The bells of Veloria did not ring that morning. For 17 years, the golden bells atop the Sunspire Tower had rung at dawn without fail, a sound so constant that the people of the kingdom no longer noticed it, the way one stops noticing their own heartbeat. But on this morning, silence hung over the capital like a held breath. Merchants stood frozen in the marketplace. Guards exchanged uneasy glances at the palace gates. And in the highest chamber of the castle, 18-year-old Princess Elara stood alone before an empty throne, staring at a crown that was never meant to be hers. Not yet. Not like this. Her mother, Queen Isolde, ruler of Veloria for over 2 decades, was gone. Not dead, worse. Vanished without a trace, in the dead of night, leaving behind nothing but a single unfinished letter and a kingdom teetering on the edge of chaos. The nobles were already whispering. The neighboring kingdoms were already watching. And somewhere in the shadows of the castle, someone knew exactly what had happened to the queen, and they were not going to tell. Elara had spent her whole life preparing to be a princess. She had never prepared to be a queen. But now, with enemies circling and a throne room full of doubtful eyes, she had no choice. The question on everyone's lips was the same one now echoing in her own heart. Can a girl who has never ruled a single day in her life hold an entire kingdom together, completely alone? Before we dive into Elara's story, if you love kingdoms, crowns, and characters who have to rise when everything falls apart, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on the bell icon. This is only the beginning of Elara's journey, and trust me, you do not want to miss what happens next. And while you're here, I'd love to know, which USA state are you watching from today? Drop it in the comments below. I read every single one, and I love seeing just how far and wide this little storytelling community of ours really reaches. Now, let's step into the world of Veloria. Veloria was not the largest kingdom on the continent, nor the wealthiest, but it was, by far, the most respected. Nestled between the Ashwood Mountains to the north and the endless blue stretch of the serene sea to the south, Veloria had spent generations building something rarer than gold: trust. Trust between its people and its crown. Trust between its farmers and its nobles. Trust that had been carefully, patiently woven by one woman, Queen Isolde. The capital city, also called Veloria, was a place of tall white towers, cobblestone streets lined with lantern posts, and a castle that seemed to glow faintly gold at sunset, as if the stone itself remembered every ruler who had ever walked its halls. Beyond the city walls stretched fields of wheat and orchards heavy with fruit, tended by families who had worked the same land for generations. Further out, near the mountains, lived the miners and blacksmiths who supplied the kingdom's famous ironwork, swords, tools, and armor known across the continent for their strength. Queen Isolde had inherited a kingdom recovering from war. Her own mother had fought a brutal border conflict with the neighboring kingdom of Draymore, a conflict that left scars still visible in the older generation's memories. When Isolde took the throne at just 23 years old, many doubted her too. But over the following 2 decades, she transformed Veloria from a wounded, wary nation into a beacon of stability. She negotiated peace with Draymore. She opened trade routes with the distant eastern territories. She built schools and villages that had never had one. She was, by every measure, a legend in her own lifetime. And she raised her daughter to inherit all of it. From the age of 6, Elara had been taught by the kingdom's finest tutors: history, diplomacy, economics, and the delicate art of listening to a room before speaking in it. She had studied swordplay not because a princess needed to fight, but because her mother believed a ruler should never feel powerless in the face of danger. She had sat quietly in the corner of the throne room during council meetings since she was 10 years old, absorbing the way her mother handled disputes between nobles, the way she softened her voice for the frightened and hardened it for the arrogant. But there is a vast difference between watching someone rule and ruling yourself. Elara had 2 people she trusted above all others. The first was Sir Callum Ashford, the captain of the Royal Guard, a man who had served under Queen Isolde since before Elara was born. Broad-shouldered, quiet, and fiercely loyal, Callum had watched Elara grow from a curious child hiding behind the throne to a poised young woman who could hold her own in a council meeting. The second was Lyra Voss, Elara's closest friend and unofficial advisor, the daughter of the kingdom's chief scholar. Lyra was sharp-tongued, endlessly curious, and possessed a memory for political history that rivaled scholars twice her age. Together, the three of them had spent years imagining what it might be like when Elara eventually took the throne. Decades from now, they always assumed, after a long and gentle transition, after years more of learning at her mother's side. They never imagined it would happen like this. Overnight, without warning, without her mother. It began as an ordinary evening. Queen Isolde had dined with Elara that night, as she often did, discussing a trade dispute with a southern province and teasing her daughter gently about a noble son who had been trying, rather clumsily, to court her. There was laughter. There was warmth. There was nothing, absolutely nothing, that suggested anything was wrong. The queen retired to her chambers a little after midnight. The guards posted outside her door confirmed she entered, and the door was locked from within, as always. By all accounts, it was a night like any other. But when Isolde's handmaiden arrived at dawn to wake her, the chamber was empty. The bed had not been slept in. The window, which overlooked a sheer drop to the castle's eastern cliffs, was open, its curtains billowing gently in the morning wind. There was no sign of struggle, no broken furniture, no blood. It was as if the queen had simply stepped outside for air and never returned. The only thing left behind was a letter, half-finished, sitting on her writing desk. The ink on the final line was smudged, as though the pen had been dropped mid-sentence. Elara, if you are reading this before I can explain in person, know that everything I have done to protect Veloria. There are things I never told you, things I hoped I would never need to. If something has happened to me, you must trust. The sentence stopped there. No name. No explanation. Nothing. By mid-morning, the news had spread through the castle like wildfire, and by afternoon, it had reached the streets. The kingdom that had never known a day without Queen Isolde's steady hand now faced a terrifying, formless uncertainty. Was she dead? Kidnapped? Had she fled? Every possibility was worse than the last because every possibility meant the same thing. Veloria was, for the first time in 20 years, without a ruler. Elara received the news in the training yard, sword still in hand, sweat on her brow from her morning practice with Callum. She remembered later that she hadn't even understood the words at first. The handmaiden's voice had been shaking so badly that the sentence came out broken and half-formed. It was only when she saw Callum's face, pale and grim, that the meaning landed. She did not cry, not at first. She simply stood there, sword still gripped tightly in her hand, staring at the castle towers as if she expected her mother to appear at one of the windows, laughing, telling her it was some elaborate lesson in crisis management. But her mother did not appear, and the silence stretched on. It was Lyra who finally broke through to her, gently prying the sword from her white-knuckled fingers and pulling her into an embrace as the first sob finally escaped. For a few minutes, Elara allowed herself to simply be a daughter who had lost her mother, grief crashing over her in waves she had no defense against. But grief, she would soon learn, is a luxury a ruler is rarely given time for. By nightfall, the royal council had convened, and Elara, barely able to keep her voice steady, was informed that, per Veloria's laws of succession, she was now, effective immediately, regent of the kingdom until the queen's fate could be determined, or until Elara's official coronation, should the worst prove true. She was 18 years old. She had never sat at the head of the council table, and now, an entire kingdom was looking to her for answers she did not have. The days that followed were unlike anything Elara had ever experienced. The council chamber, once a place of measured discussion beneath her mother's calm authority, became a battlefield of whispers and hidden agendas. Some nobles offered genuine sympathy and support. Others saw only opportunity. Lord Bastionthorn, the head of Veloria's wealthiest merchant house, and a man who had long resented the limits placed on noble power by Queen Isolde's reforms, was among the first to speak against Elara's authority. In a council session just 3 days after the queen's disappearance, he stood and addressed the room with practiced, poisoned politeness. With the utmost respect for Princess Elara, he began, bowing just slightly. "We cannot ignore that Veloria faces threats that require an experienced hand. A regency council of senior nobles, myself included, of course, would better serve the kingdom during this delicate period." Several nobles murmured in agreement. Elara felt her stomach tighten, but she kept her expression steady, the way her mother had taught her. Never let them see you rattled, even when you are. "The law of succession is clear, Lord Thorn," Elara replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "I am my mother's heir, and until proven otherwise, I remain Veloria's rightful regent. If you have concerns about my judgment, I welcome you to voice them individually, to my face, not through half-formed proposals dressed as concern for the kingdom." The room fell silent. It was the first time Elara had spoken with true authority since her mother's disappearance, and for a brief moment, she saw something shift in the eyes around the table. Not full trust, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of it. Not everyone opposed her, of course. Duchess Marin Willow, an older noblewoman who had served as one of Queen Isolde's closest confidants for over a decade, quickly became one of Elara's staunchest allies, offering guidance without ever undermining the princess's authority. General Petra Voss, no relation to Lyra, despite the shared name, commander of Veloria's armed forces, pledged her loyalty without hesitation, having served under Isolde since the border conflicts with Draymore. But the kingdom's troubles were not limited to internal politics. Word soon reached the castle that Draymore's forces had begun massing near the border, a clear test of Veloria's stability now that its queen was gone. Whether it was genuine aggression or simply Draymore testing the waters to see how weak Veloria had become without Isolde, the threat was very real. Elara now faced a decision no council session, no tutor, and no childhood lesson had ever fully prepared her for. How does an untested regent respond to the threat of war, while half her own court doubted her right to rule at all? The messenger from the border arrived on a rain-soaked evening, nearly collapsing from exhaustion as he delivered his report. Draymore's forces, he explained, had crossed into the disputed borderlands near Fallow Ridge, technically Velorian territory under the treaty Isolde herself had negotiated years earlier, though Draymore had long argued the boundary should sit further west. It was, in many ways, a calculated provocation. Not quite an act of war, but close enough to force a response. Everyone in the council chamber understood the deeper message beneath the border dispute. Draymore was testing whether Veloria, without its queen, would fold. The council split immediately into two camps. General Petra Voss argued for a swift, decisive military response, a show of force to make clear that Veloria's strength had not diminished. Lord Thorn, perhaps unsurprisingly, argued for concession, framing it as pragmatic diplomacy, though Elara suspected his motives had far more to do with protecting his trade interests with Draymore than any genuine desire for peace. That night, unable to sleep, Elara found herself in the castle library, standing before the shelf where her mother kept years of private journals. She had never read them before. They had always felt too personal, too much like trespassing into a part of her mother's life that wasn't meant for her yet. But that night, desperate for guidance, she opened one dated nearly 15 years earlier, not long after Isolde had negotiated the original peace treaty with Draymore. Strength without wisdom starts wars. Wisdom without strength invites them. A ruler must show both, never react from fear, and never mistake patience for weakness. Draymore understands only one language fully, the certainty that Veloria will not be pushed, but also will not strike first without cause. It was as if her mother, even absent, was still teaching her. The next morning, Elara made her decision. She would not send the army charging to the border, as General Voss initially proposed, nor would she quietly cede the territory, as Lord Thorn urged. Instead, she would go to the border herself, accompanied by a modest but visible military escort, to personally meet with Draymore's commanding officer, a bold, almost reckless move that shocked her entire council. "You cannot possibly mean to go yourself," Lord Thorn protested. "It's far too dangerous and, frankly, beneath the dignity of—" "It is exactly because I am untested that I must go myself," Elara interrupted, her voice firm. If I hide behind these walls while my soldiers face the risk, I confirm every doubt anyone has about me. If I stand at that border myself, I show Draymore, and every noble in this room, exactly what kind of ruler Veloria now has. It was, admittedly, the boldest decision of her young life. The journey to Fallow Ridge took 2 days. When Elara arrived, flanked by General Voss and a disciplined but restrained contingent of soldiers, she found Draymore's commander, a stern, gray-haired man named Commander Aldrich Vane, waiting with visible skepticism etched across his face. Their meeting was tense. Vane made thinly veiled threats about Veloria's instability under its inexperienced leadership. Elara held her ground, calmly reminding him of the treaty her mother had negotiated, the decades of peace it had secured, and the mutual benefits both kingdoms had reaped from it. "Commander Vane," she said calmly, "let us speak honestly. Your forces are not prepared for a prolonged conflict, and mine are fully capable of holding this border indefinitely. Neither of us benefits from a war neither of us can sustain. I propose we return to the original treaty boundary, with a formal renewal ceremony in the capital, a chance for Draymore to be seen as a partner in peace, rather than a kingdom that provoked instability during Veloria's time of grief." It was a masterstroke, an offer that allowed Draymore to retreat without appearing weak, while firmly reasserting Veloria's boundaries and strength. Vane, recognizing both the accuracy of Elara's assessment and the graciousness of her offer, agreed. The border crisis was resolved without a single arrow loosed. Elara returned to the capital a changed woman in the eyes of her council, no longer simply the queen's daughter, but a regent who had proven, decisively, that she could act with both courage and wisdom under pressure. But the celebration was short-lived. That very night, Callum discovered something deeply troubling while reviewing the castle's guard logs from the evening of the Queen's disappearance. One of the night guards assigned to the royal wing, a man named Denner, had quietly left Veloria's service and vanished just 2 days after the Queen went missing, and his final wages had been paid not by the royal treasury, but by an untraceable third party. Further investigation, led quietly by Lyra using her father's extensive network of scholarly and merchant contacts, revealed something even more damning. Denner had been seen, weeks before the Queen's disappearance, meeting privately with a representative from Lord Thorne's merchant house. The pieces began falling into place, with sickening clarity. Lord Thorne, resentful of Isolde's reforms and desperate to regain the unchecked noble power his family once held, had likely orchestrated something against the Queen, whether her removal, her kidnapping, or worse, remained unclear. But the trail led unmistakably back to him. When confronted in a private council session, with evidence laid plainly before him, Thorne's composed facade finally cracked. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," he spat, abandoning all pretense. "Your mother's reforms were bleeding this kingdom's noble houses dry. Someone needed to act before." "Before what?" Elara demanded, her voice trembling with barely contained fury. "Before my mother continued protecting the people of this kingdom instead of your personal fortune? Where is she, Thorne?" But Thorne, perhaps realizing the weight of what he'd already admitted, refused to say more, demanding a formal trial rather than incriminating himself further. He was arrested that very night, his estate placed under guard, his considerable influence over the council effectively neutralized. But the truth of what had actually happened to Queen Isolde remained frustratingly out of reach. Thorne, it seemed, had hired intermediaries specifically to keep his own hands clean and his knowledge limited, likely anticipating exactly this outcome. Still, it was a turning point. Whatever had happened to her mother, Elara now knew with certainty that it had been no accident, no simple disappearance, and she was determined to uncover the rest of the truth, no matter how long it took. With Thorne's betrayal exposed and the border crisis resolved, word of Elara's decisive leadership spread quickly through Veloria, from the castle halls to the marketplace stalls to the distant mountain villages. The girl once dismissed as too young, too inexperienced, too untested, had faced war and treachery within her first weeks as regent and emerged from both with the kingdom stronger, not weaker. But one final challenge remained: the formal coronation council, where Veloria's assembled nobility would vote on whether Elara would be confirmed as Veloria's rightful ruler, or whether, In the continued absence of confirmed information about Queen Isolde's fate, a regency council would be installed instead, as some conservative nobles still quietly preferred. The chamber was packed the day of the vote, tension thick in the air. Elara stood before the assembled nobility, not as a frightened girl seeking permission, but as a leader who had already proven her worth through action rather than words alone. 3 weeks ago, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the silent hall, many of you believed I could not hold this kingdom together. I understood that doubt. I shared it myself, in the quiet hours when no one was watching. I never asked to rule Veloria. I always assumed I would have years more to learn at my mother's side before this weight ever fell to me. She paused, letting her gaze move across the room, meeting the eyes of nobles who had doubted her and those who had supported her in equal measure. But that is not the path fate chose for us. My mother is gone, and until the truth of what happened to her is uncovered, this kingdom needs someone willing to stand in the gap, not out of ambition, but out of duty to everything she spent her life building. I have faced Draymore at our border and secured peace without a single life lost. I have uncovered treachery within our own council and held those responsible accountable, regardless of their wealth or standing. I am not asking you to trust me because I am my mother's daughter. I am asking you to trust me because of what I have already shown you I am capable of. The silence that followed felt endless. Then, slowly, Duchess Willow rose to her feet, followed by General Voss, followed by noble after noble across the chamber, until the vote was no longer even necessary to formally announce. The room itself had answered. Elara was confirmed, unanimously among those present, as Veloria's rightful ruler.